Coming up. So what is something that is obvious that large numbers of people refuse to acknowledge? And by the way, for this one, large numbers is an understatement. Millions of people refuse to acknowledge it. What is it? Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, it's pretty hard not to talk about the riots which have erupted in so many American cities. Covering that subject, let's start with something that's obvious, that virtually everybody acknowledges, and then move on to things that are also obvious that large numbers of people will not acknowledge, including the loudest voices, the most prominent platforms. The first thing I want to say is how disturbing all of this is. There's no reason for violence like this to be occurring. The one thing that virtually everybody agrees on is that what happened to George Floyd is horrendous. We'll see what comes out in the trial of the officer who kneeled on his neck for 9 minutes, and any fair-minded person, any person who wants a trial in a court, in a justice system, not mob rule, agrees that he has to have his day in court. But I have a hard time understanding how the evidence presented could ever change the conclusion that his behavior went beyond what police are allowed to do to detain a subject. If he had to kneel on his neck to start with, and I acknowledge there could be a circumstance where he had to, and if so, his defense team will present that in court. What I can't understand is why he would ever need to kneel on the neck of a handcuffed subject for 9 minutes. So what are the things that are obvious? The things that are obvious is that notwithstanding the claims of CNN and much of the mainstream media, it isn't an accurate statement to describe what's happening around the country as peaceful protests. What's happening is rioting. And in some instances, like the shooting of the federal law enforcement officer guarding the U.S. courthouse in Oakland, it looks like it could best be described as domestic terrorism. Does that mean that all of the people participating in the protests around the country are rioters? Of course not. Does it mean that most people participating in the protests around the country are rioters? Of course not. Does it mean that a substantial portion of the people participating in the protests around the country are rioters? Yes, it does. However, there is filmed evidence of protesters trying to stop looting, of protesters trying to stop violence. How prevalent is that? We really can't tell, because it fits the narrative of much of the media that these are peaceful protests, so if such instances hardly ever occur, the media will still tout them as if they're the norm. On the other hand, they may in fact be very common. And politicians are far from immune from that same type of misdirection. The mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota, claimed that every person arrested at the Minneapolis protests was from out of state. The mayor of Minneapolis, in referring to the rioting, said that, quote, "The people that are doing this are not Minneapolis residents. They're coming in largely from outside of this city, outside of the region," close quote. The governor of Minnesota claimed that roughly 80% of the rioters were from outside of the state. The mayor of St. Paul was then confronted by actual arrest record research by local television station KARE 11, which showed that nearly all of those arrested on Friday night were from Minneapolis and surrounding areas. 56 out of 69 persons arrested were confirmed to be from Minnesota, specifically Minneapolis or surrounding areas. There were 5 persons arrested who were listed as unknown with regard to their residence. 8 other persons were from out of state, specifically 1 from each of the following states: Arkansas, Florida, Iowa, Missouri, and Michigan, including 3, though, from Illinois. When questioned, the mayor of St. Paul corrected his prior statement and said he had received bad information from the police. Incidentally, the checking of public records by the local television station, thereby disproving the statements of local politicians, is so typical of the way news in America works. If you want to get the real story on a local event, you're much more likely to get it by going to local news outlets rather than to national news sites. It's with national news that you have the greatest likelihood of management stepping in and mandating that a particular story be massaged to fit the narrative being pursued. Are there any news sites that you can always trust? Not really. There are some that you can trust more than others, but the reality is that citizens with televisions and access to the internet can't sit back and let the news be presented to them. In reality, what they've done is bought a hunting license, and it's the citizens' job to dig through the news sites and news coverage to get to the truth, or at least to try to compare and evaluate and apply common sense and identify the biases that you know exist in the reporters and the commentators. I wish it were easier, but it's not. And by the way, that lack of a reliable resource is one more reason to add a podcast to your news mix to offset other sources. I have one in mind, by the way. So back to the issue of outsiders and the rioting. Am I saying that the rioting is being done all by locals? No, I don't believe that. However, I suspect the looting is disproportionately done by locals, and I'll suspect we'll start to see some evidence of that. So if the vast majority of arrests in Minneapolis over Friday night were of locals, does that really mean that the most severe, most destructive rioting was done by locals? Does it mean that the locals weren't agitated by non-local interlopers or agitators? I suspect, but don't know, that there is a very significant presence of outside agitators that have entered Minneapolis and the other cities where rioting has occurred. Based on their appearance, covered in all black, with face coverings and often forms of personal protective gear, as well as being almost always white, often skinny, and otherwise presenting an appearance somewhat reminiscent of what we've seen in repeated violent protests in Portland, Oregon, for example, I suspect that a large number of the outside agitators are associated with Antifa, by any means necessary, or other left-wing anarchist or communist organizations. There are some who claim that the agitators are white supremacists or white nationalists who are trying to start a race war to achieve their goals. That's possible, but it strikes me as much less likely. I say that because we've seen this play out before on a smaller scale with Antifa in cities across the country. We've seen it for years. Check out @MrAndyNo on Twitter. He's been studying, investigating, and reporting on Antifa, and he's been on the receiving end of the violence of which they're capable. After listening to this podcast, I urge you to go to spectator.us and read Andy's article entitled Antifa's American Insurgency, which is subtitled The Far Left Has Perfected the Art of Rioting. The first 3 sentences of the article are chilling. Quote, "We are witnessing glimmers of the full insurrection the far left has been working toward for decades. The killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis was merely a pretext for radicals to push their ambitious insurgency. In a matter of hours after the video of Floyd began circulating the internet, militant Antifa cells across the country mobilized to Minnesota to aid Black Lives Matter rioters." Close quote. Andy No goes into detail about the tactics of Antifa. Quote, "Antifa, the extreme anarchist communist movement, has rioting down to an art. The first broken window is the blood in the water for looters to move in. When the looting is done, those carrying flammable chemicals start fires to finish the job. Footage recorded in Minneapolis and other cities show militants dressed in black bloc, the Antifa uniform, wielding weapons like hammers or sticks to smash windows. You see their graffiti daubed on smashed-up buildings. FTP means the police. ACAB means all cops are bastards. 1312 is the numerical code for ACAB." Close quote. As No points out, Black Lives Matter is a, quote, "revolutionary Marxist ideology," close quote. And, quote, "Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors, BLM's founders, are self-identified Marxists who make no secret of their worship of communist terrorists and fugitives like Assata Shakur," close quote. They want the, quote, abolishment of law enforcement and capitalism, close quote. And per Andy No, Antifa has partnered with Black Lives Matter for now. BLM and Antifa both want to end capitalism. Our economy is down right now because of the COVID-19 lockdowns, and they're trying to use that to their advantage. Never lose sight of the fact that BLM and Antifa are anti-capitalist. Never lose sight of that fact when Democrats who refuse to criticize those organizations, who excuse their actions, even laud them, then claim that they're trying to improve the economy. They aren't. They're trying to destroy the economy. So what is something that's obvious that large numbers of people refuse to acknowledge? And by the way, for this one, large numbers is an understatement. Millions of people refuse to acknowledge it. What is it? It's the fact that no evidence has been presented that the cop who was kneeling on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes was motivated by racism. Nothing has been presented. No racist statements, no history of treating races differently in the same circumstances, no evidence of membership in racist organizations, no evidence of refusal to socialize with African Americans on the police force or elsewhere. I know it's only been 6 days since George Floyd's death, but this is certainly the biggest story in the United States, and it's a major story worldwide. I would expect every news organization, as well as multiple political activist organizations, to be poring over everything they could possibly find regarding former police officer Derek Chauvin. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't evidence that he was in fact racist. After all, as I've noted, it's only been 6 days. But the fact that none of that has been provided means that every member of the news media who says that George Floyd died because of his race, every activist who says that George Floyd died because he was black, every politician who says that George Floyd's death is proof of racism in America, every friend and acquaintance you know who accuses the cops involved in the arrest of racism is operating based on an assumption. They literally are assuming that because George Floyd was black, and either because the person who knelt on his neck was a cop, or because the person who knelt on his neck was a white cop, the cop did it because George Floyd was black. If they're reaching that conclusion because of the race of the cop, ironically, there's a word for that assumption. It's racism. Their assumption that the white cop knelt on the neck of the black suspect, resulting in his death because the cop was racist, is itself racist. There used to be a time when we knew that. When we recognized that, when we understood the blanket application of conclusions about conduct or beliefs or attributes based on the color of one's skin was unacceptable. And as we all know, that understanding arose out of our previous violation of all of those rules, out of our historic racist assumptions about all sorts of tendencies and characteristics and competencies that we assumed not based on the demonstrated content of an individual's character, but rather based on the color of their skin. Unfortunately, rather than moving into a societal norm where we all recognize that people are individuals, not just a collection of demographic characteristics, where each man and woman is their own person, we've moved to a status where huge numbers of our population, led by members of the society with the largest bullhorns, much of the political class, the news media, Hollywood celebrities, and academia, pitch the assumption that our society is inherently racist, that typical Americans go through their days motivated by hatred of and adverse assumptions regarding African Americans and other minorities. And that assumption is on display virtually throughout the news media and no doubt in massive numbers of conversations occurring throughout the country and among those protesting throughout the country. It wouldn't make George Floyd any less dead if people realized that no evidence has been presented that the cop that caused his death was motivated by racism. But it might give them the motivation to pause, to consider that perhaps the right approach is to wait to see what happens in the justice system, or to protest, but to do so on less of a razor's edge, less inclined to escalate when confrontations occur, less inclined to strike out at those perceived as disagreeing with the point being made, less inclined to strike out at police who clearly were not the ones involved in the detention of George Floyd, but who are wearing the same uniform. We would all be better off if that were to occur. Unfortunately, I doubt the media will let it. They are far too invested in the conflict. It draws clicks, it draws eyeballs, and the more anxiety it induces, the more anger it causes, the more arguments it promotes, the more eyeballs and clicks expand. Have you noticed what's missing? Have you noticed any widespread media criticism of protesters and rioters not maintaining a 6-foot separation? Most of the rioting has occurred in cities still under some significant level of lockdown for COVID-19. I must have missed Don Lemon and Brian Stelter chastising the protesters and rioters for lack of social distancing and asking, "Haven't you been listening to Dr. Fauci?" But they won't do that because they don't care. It's about promoting the narrative and doing so in a way that bumps their numbers. COVID-19 is so last week. They don't need it now. If the riots end soon, as I hope and pray they will, I predict that we'll begin seeing lots of coverage about a potential second wave of COVID-19 and individual stories of loss of life in Republican states which have reopened sooner than other states. I hope, oh how I do hope, and I pray that when I come back next week with another episode of Political Spirits, I won't be talking about the riots, because the riots will have ended. Will that be the case? Will the anger in cities across the country have died down? Will large numbers of Antifa terrorists have been arrested? Will the organization have been formally labeled as what it is, a terrorist organization? Something that President Trump tweeted today his administration would actually do? I don't know. I wish I had the answers. Like you, I'll be watching, and I'll be researching, and God forbid, if this is still going on in a week, I'll be reporting back to you about it again. But if not, I'll still be back with another episode of Political Spirits. Be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.